Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.deborahrrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Do you know your business email compromise history? From pig in a poke to today, my guest, Darrell R. James, a former FBI agent, is here to talk business email compromise scams. So if you want to know what pig in a poke means and how many hundreds of years ago it was and more, keep listening. Welcome to episode 216, Business Email Compromise Scams History with Darrell R. James, a former FBI agent. Today, I have with me Darrell R. James, and I'll let him introduce himself, but I met him through an association that we both belong to, and someone was on the thread talking about fraud, and he mentioned, hey, well, business email compromise, or BEC, has been around longer than that. It just wasn't called that. And so I thought, wow, I need to talk to him. And so we met, and I thought he would be great to come on the podcast and talk about fraud that we're seeing in accounts payable and how that has kind of evolved from where he started seeing it back in the day. So I do want to introduce Darrell R. James. And Darrell, if you can go ahead and just do a brief bio and talk a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, so thank you, Deborah, first of all, for having me on. Look forward to going over some of the things we're going to talk about today. But like you said, so my name again is Darrell James. I have been in law enforcement. I was a special agent with the FBI for 26 years, and I investigated primarily white collar crime, different type of fraud schemes. And also I worked in the corporate sector as a fraud investigator, investigating fraud, waste, and abuse in the healthcare sector. So I've been doing this, and now I own my own company, DR James and Associates, investigation and consulting. And so I've been doing this for 30 years and have got a little experience with different types of fraud schemes.
Ah, okay. Is that both internal and external fraud?
Yes, that would be correct. Yeah. So those are schemes directed at individuals and schemes directed at companies, like we're going to talk about a little more today. But and you said you mentioned the thread where we kind of ran across each other, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and the question that came up. And I thought about that when the question was asked about the business email compromise. And my point, and I don't know if it came across as maybe a little bit of smart alecky, but
that resonates.
I didn't mean it that way.
That resonates with me, so it's totally good.
Well, good. I'm glad. Maybe it did. Maybe just thinking about it. But no, my point was that because the question was about the latest schemes and what people are seeing. But my point was kind of that, the basis of these schemes, I guess, have always been around. It's just the technology today allows people to do them differently, and unfortunately, in some cases, probably more effective than some of the old school ways of doing the schemes.
Yeah, and what's so funny is, right, all the technology that allows the good folks to do more things, it's also allowing the bad folks to do more things.
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Right. Technology works in both
Yeah.
ways, and for all the good it can do, there are people who will figure out how to use it for to do
Yeah.
bad things.
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned that you were with the FBI for 20 plus years. And I will say that since I've been a consultant and I started this podcast like back in 2018, I have been reviewing and referencing the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, their annual report, the IC3 annual report, where they track fraud and business email compromise or BEC, right, where a request is for the most part for accounts payable teams and vendor teams anyway, a request is received via email from supposedly the vendor or an internal team member to change the vendor's banking. And of course, it's a fraudster, so it goes out. But I do track like what those incident volumes are and also the total losses per year. We know it's been trending up since even before the pandemic, but you've been following it much longer than I have, right? Probably before it was even called business email compromise. So, can you kind of delve into that a little bit more? I know you kind of started on it, but define what business email compromise is, especially if it has if it had like a different definition than what we're seeing today. But talk about the evolution into that scam that we see today, especially in accounts payable and the vendor team.
Okay. Yeah, so business email compromise, as we know, it's also called email account compromise. It's a financially damaging online crime, and that's where the technology comes in because it's mainly using, obviously, technology online and emails. It exploits the fact that so many of us rely on email now to conduct our business. And you brought up a very good point when you mentioned the pandemic, right? So
Yeah.
that, in my opinion, and you may have seen something on this that I haven't read, but in my opinion, that accelerated this type of scheme because more people started working from home. They were working independently, so to speak. And so, the use of email and things like that gave the scammers even more opportunity to commit these types of crimes versus maybe when you're working in an office type of environment and there are probably a few more controls and checks and balances that are in place than now. But yeah, it's just a sophisticated scam, targets businesses by gaining access to an employee or supplier email address and requesting a change to a supplier's bank account. And then once the bank account is changed, the fraudster can receive any payments that were originally meant for the supplier. And so, as you spoke earlier, of course, there've been fraud schemes forever, right? As long as people have been trading things, bartering things, there were fraud schemes. There were fraud schemes. There was a scheme called the pig in a poke scam back in the 15th century, right? Where farmers would sell pigs and they put them in bags and they would actually substitute cats for the pigs and exchange those instead of actually selling the pig, right?
Wait a minute. Did you say back in the 1500s?
Well, actually, it was the 1400s. It was the 15th century.
1400s,
Yeah.
15th century. Okay, but same thing. It's like, okay, so it's before the Nigerian prince, I guess is where I was
exactly
going.
right. Yeah, you and I, when we think of fraud scams, we think of the Nigerian prince, the lottery
Yes.
scams, that type of modern day thing. And you probably thought, okay, he'll probably lead off with something like that. And I go all the way back to the 1400s and start talking about the pig and a poke scam. But it's, but it's just an example of how, like I said, scams have been around forever. And again, it's the means in which they're carried out, right? We're talking about exchanging one animal for another and using probably a burlap sack or some kind of sack just to put it in. And then you fast forward, into the 1800s, and you have what was called the green goods scam, where people would actually sell counterfeit currency. Like we know in the United States back then, a lot of states produce their own currency. It wasn't a federal currency like we have today. And so people could purchase a counterfeit currency, and the scammers would actually switch out these counterfeit bills, which they were selling obviously for undervalue, but switch them out for like sawdust, or while the person wasn't looking, and give them a bag of sawdust versus giving them the bag of counterfeit currency. And again, fraud schemes, right? And the first federal law enforcement agencies, the Postal Service, which was the first federal law enforcement agency, and you had the marshals, and then the Secret Service, were all started because of fraud schemes, right? The Secret Service investigated counterfeiting, which began after the Civil War in the 1860s. A lot of people think the Secret Service has always been protection details for the president and vice president and so forth, but they were actually started as an investigative agency because of those type of fraud schemes. So that just shows again how fraud has gone, how far back it goes, and again just the evolution of the different types of schemes. And then, of course, the mail fraud statutes, which were enacted in the 1870s because the government didn't want people using a U.S. government agency, the Postal Service, to commit fraud, right? So they came up with a statute that would people could be prosecuted for using the mail. And then wire fraud, the wire fraud statute didn't come along until the 1950s. Again, as technology changed and people started using telephones and other forms of communication, it was just an extension of the mail fraud statute, but it was for those other means of communication that people were using to commit fraud. So that's just a little background, probably more history than you wanted to know about.
Wow. But you know what that says? It says that from pig in a poke, right, to the green goods scam, to the 1950s wire fraud, and kind of everything in between up until today, it's always been kind of a reactionary thing to fraud. And I guess that's the way, because that's just the nature of it. Is that true? Because you don't know what to protect against until something happens.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Right. It's very reactionary. And as we know, Congress, with the laws, the law enforcement has been, I guess the term is slow, but we've had to react to what the scammers are doing, because they figure out if there's a new technology, a new way to commit a fraud, they're going to go ahead and do it. And they're going to be innovative and creative and try to figure out, how can I use this to take people's money, right? To convince people to give me their money. And then, the laws have to be enacted to try to combat that. And so, it's always that way. Crypto, right? It's the latest thing. And again, Congress and the laws haven't caught up with it yet. They're trying to catch up and figure out, how do we combat some of the fraud that is going on using cryptocurrencies.
That is a very good point, right? Because you've got law enforcement and, agencies that are really reactionary, because that's just the nature of it, right? And you guys are trained, and then you have the folks that come into work every day and try to, process a vendor request. So it's not far to say, right, that they have to keep up as well. The same way that you guys are keeping up, even though it's reactionary, you still have to do that. We have to do the same thing because we're coming up against fraud as well. So everyone has to keep, I guess, evolving what they're doing in response to the frauds that are evolving today, I guess is my point.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's about awareness. Right. And I know companies, businesses spend a lot of time and money on trying to make sure their employees are aware and trained for different types of scams. And that's on the business side. And from an individual side, again, individuals the same way, because they're being targeted. When I first started in law enforcement, we would you had these telemarketers and we call them boiler room scams, where they were just calling people on the phone, right? You'd have these boiler rooms set up, and these guys or telemarketers would be in there calling people, trying to get them to invest in something or to send their money for some reason. And we would do search warrants on these places, and you would find this list of names of people with their phone numbers, and these lists would get passed around from scammer to scammer, right? And that was kind of the now considered old school way of doing things, but that was the technology at the time. That was before everybody had a personal computer and was on the internet. That was the way of doing those scams back in the 90s and the early 2000s.
Yeah, and they're still doing those, by the way, because I already know, like around 5:30, 6 o'clock, they're probably sharing my name and cell phone number with everybody in America because I get from all the fraudsters, like from here to wherever, because I know I'm gonna get a few calls and I'll pick up because, right, I don't know who it might be if it doesn't get flagged as potential spam. But I
Right.
pick up because I don't know who it's going to be. And all of a sudden, I hear what sounds like a boiler room, calling center in the background. And then I know to just click. So I used to engage, but I've just learned not to do that anymore. It doesn't matter if you do or not. They're just going to hang up and call you again the next day.
That's exactly right. Right. Yeah. And so those methods, because they were tried and true, are still being used.
Yeah.
The only thing is when we talk about business email compromise and the technology, especially with businesses, it can be for the fraudster, you can get a lot more money a lot faster. So I guess it's a more efficient fraud scheme than calling individuals like you or me and trying to get us to commit to some type of fraud scheme and send money, right? It's you may hit the
Oh,
jackpot,
yeah.
get the right person, or you may not. But with businesses, it doesn't take much, and if you can put it in place, you can really get a lot of money quickly, and and then just move on to the next one.
Well, yeah, and I talked about earlier the FBI report that I look at every year. And so for
Right.
2021, the average business email compromise loss per incident was 120,000. And it's not like the millions that we hear about and think, oh, my company we don't pay that much. Yeah, they're looking at smaller amounts, but yeah, they're not going to get that from me. So you better, maybe that's what I should tell them when they call.
Well, right, exactly, and that's the thing. And like you said, the IC3 reports, and I know you've seen this. I think the FBI, the last one I saw was also from 2021, and they were
Yeah.
saying that it's about 43 billion in losses, both nationally and internationally, from these kind of fraud schemes,
Yeah.
which are basically according to the FBI again, the business email compromise is the biggest, largest as far as dollar amount fraud scheme that they're seeing right now. It used to be
Yeah.
the romance schemes, like you were talking about the Nigerian romance letters, and even they became from letters to emails.
Yeah.
But now these business email compromise schemes have jumped over those and are the biggest schemes out there because, and again, my opinion, and I haven't talked to anybody FBI that told me this, but I think it's just because of the large amounts. Like you said, when you're getting over $120,000 on average or whatever it is, then that's a lot more than individuals are normally going to be able to or are going to be willing to part with on a one-time basis on a fraud scheme.
Yeah, and I call accounts payable, right, where the vendors are set up, where they can update the remittance information, where they generate the payments. I call AP the bank, right? Because where do you go when you want money? You go to the bank. Well, where do fraudsters go if they want to pretend to be a vendor to get their money? They go to AP. And so we know, right, that the fraudsters, just like we're going to work every day, they're going to work every day, just evolving, trying to find new ways to part companies, right, with their money. And so what are the newest twists? I think we kind of already touched on it, but what are you finding are the newest twists that they're using to make these scams more successful?
Well, and it's when you specifically talk about business email compromise,
Yeah.
I think it's the way that these scammers are setting up. I talked about the boiler rooms a little bit,
Yeah.
and some of the older scams where they were personnel intensive and labor intensive, right? You had to have a number of people. What business email compromise has allowed these scammers to do is a lot of times it could be one or two people using the technology. So they'll set up they'll spoof email accounts, right? So they'll take a company email account and just closely mimic what the legitimate email would look like for once they identify a person in that company that's in a position to make the account changes they want, and then they can take those email accounts, and I've had cases where they actually go and get a domain and set up and just make the names look very close to a legitimate company, find out who their customers are, and they started sending emails from their new domain, spoofing the legitimate company and saying, hey, we need you to start sending your accounts payable, start sending the money to this account versus the old account that we gave you before. And if people don't, go through, do the due diligence and follow normally controls they have in place, then they will start sending the money. And it's happened over and over again that businesses do that because people are busy, high volume of emails, they're going through all this. And again, the spoofing is very close to what they would normally see. And so they quickly look at it and think, okay, it's from somebody I've been dealing with at this other company, and I'll implement the change that they're requesting, and I'll move on to the next thing that I have to do on my list of 1,000 things you have to do in a day when you're in a corporate environment. And they don't think anything of it until the legitimate company calls back or sends an email and says, hey, we haven't been paid in a week or 2 weeks or however long it's been. And they're like, oh, yes, you have. And they're like, no, we haven't. And then they start comparing notes, right? And they realize something has gone wrong. And unfortunately, by that time, a lot of times the money is just gone, and it's very hard to retrieve, or you can't retrieve it at all.
And I think what's getting worse now too is, and you can tell me if you've seen this, right, is the scammers or fraudsters, right, because they've been so successful with all the phishing emails to get login credentials, or I don't know, maybe they purchased it out on the dark web or something. They have the login information, and they might even be in, or they might hack into the actual email. And so the email is coming from the vendors, or even maybe even the internal employees' email, again, making it appear more legitimate.
Yeah, and I personally, I've heard of that. I haven't seen that as much in the work I've done, but social engineering, right? So that's the quote unquote term that's used for it, where, like you said, they find a legitimate employee, they start getting information either directly from them or through social media sites, right? Facebook, Instagram, whatever, to build, and then they are able to basically mimic that employee, and where they don't even have to spoof the email address. They can get that and figure out, what their passwords are and things like that. That takes a little more time, a little more effort and work. It does happen, like you said.
Yeah.
Whereas the spoofing, right? Again, it's easier for one or two people to do it. Set up an account, set up a domain, and just send it out. And I'll tell you, I did a presentation on business email compromise to a company, and in my preparation, one of the things, I was talking about spoofing emails, and they had an example, and I had to look at the example for several minutes to tell the difference between two emails. And I was looking for it. I mean, I'm looking because they said, okay, these two email addresses are different and people will send similar. And it took me, and I'm looking, I'm like, where's the difference? And it was just one letter in a name that could be spelled. It was Kelly, spelled K-E-L-L-E-Y or K-E-L-L-Y. But if you get that email and you're used to dealing with John Kelly at whatever.com, right? You may not look that closely because you've seen that name. Once you see John Kelly, it's at the company name.com, you just think, okay, that's, the guy that I've dealt with in their accounts receivable all the time. And he's telling me he needs to change this account. Okay, I'll do it and keep moving. And like I said, it was just one letter, and it took me in, again, I was looking for it. I was looking for it. It took me several minutes of being diligent, like, oh, okay, here it is. Here's the letter.
Wait, you were looking for it, and you weren't distracted, and you didn't have 100 other things, and you didn't have somebody standing at your desk, or if you're working from home, you didn't have, the TV up too loud, or the kid crying, or somebody wants to eat, or.
And that just shows how you could see how this happens to people. And you think, well, they're not paying attention. Well, they're trying to pay attention. They're trying to do the job. But
Right.
and as you know, and I've worked in a corporate environment. I mean, you
Yeah.
just get so many emails, and you're trying to go through them, and you're trying to get to things that you think are important, and then somebody else sends you something and says, "I need you to do this," and you're like, "Okay, I got to get this done." And if you're not just being very diligent and paying attention, it could very easily happen, and obviously it does happen.
Yeah, and it's understandable too, right? Because especially in accounts payable, I would guess larger organizations, because I've worked in like all sizes, but the last 10 or so years it was with larger organizations in the accounts payable department. And I will tell you, we accounts payable, we didn't have the relationship with those vendors, right? So we would get in an email and we weren't expecting it. It would have an attachment on it, either an invoice or some supporting documentation for, setting up a vendor or changing a vendor. But we wouldn't have the luxury of saying, oh, you know what, this doesn't, we're not going to open it because we weren't expecting this email. Well, we're not expecting any emails. We just get what we get. And then the other thing is they say don't click on links that you're not familiar
You're
with
not
or that
familiar with,
have some.
right?
Yeah, but that's all we get again is links to, and there's no like universal anything when you're dealing with accounts payable. There's no universal invoice, there's no universal form or way to collect information to set up a vendor. So everything's different, and we don't have the relationship with the vendor. Like we wouldn't have known if somebody sent if some email was supposed to be Kelly Kelly or Kelli, because we don't know. We don't have the relationship with them. And I think that's where a big part of that vulnerability is in accounts payable, and why fraudsters just kind of pounce on it, because some of them know that. And I know, or they know that. And I know some accounts payable teams may be small enough, but they may, know their vendors or don't have a larger volume, and so they can take more time. But if you've got, an accounts pay, especially at year end, when we're taping this is December, so it's prime time. You get
Right.
busy, you got a lot of stuff you need to process. You're not expecting emails, but you still have to process them. So it's just vulnerable. That the team is just kind of vulnerable, and I think the fraudsters know that, and they're taking advantage.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
exactly right. And yeah, they're just taking advantage of, and they only need one or two, right? They're sending out so many of these, and
Yeah.
everyone doesn't work for them, but the few that do, that's where they hit. So it's a volume game.
So, okay, so I just painted a little bleak thing there. So we have to try to reverse that. So we know that, accounts payable, right? We've got some great folks working in accounts payable, but there are just circumstances around what we're doing that's just kind of stacking everything against them towards being victims to fraud. But what are some of the best tips that they can use to avoid business email compromise or other social engineering scams?
Yeah, and so I think with these types of scams, the good news is, like you said, there are things that each individual or company can do to avoid the scams that aren't very quote unquote sophisticated, or it's just basic things. It's just being disciplined and doing them right, having and
Yes.
convincing employees to do them. So we talked about some of these things earlier, right? First, carefully examining email addresses, URLs, spellings that are used in correspondence, right? So, like I talked about with the Kelley or Kelly, the little differences there. Just taking an extra second to make sure this is the person that you've been dealing with. You talked about being careful not to click on links and being careful with what you download, right?
Yeah.
Don't open attachments. And we've all heard these, right? The IT departments, or we get inundated with the training.
Yeah.
Two-factor authentication on accounts, uh, verifying payment and purchase requests. Uh, you know, it- Obviously with large companies, like you said, it's not going to be done in person. And
Right.
you know better than I, because you've worked in accounts payable. The bigger the company, right, the harder it is, because the salespeople are dealing with the vendors, and you're not dealing with
Yeah.
them. You're just there to take the information. And so
Right.
sometimes that gets lost a little bit. But whatever type of verification that the company can put in place, whether it's here's the person that you're going to be dealing with at this company, or the email address, verify any changes in account numbers or payment procedures, right, with the person making the request, or with a known number. And that's no different from a company or an individual, right? Your bank sends you
Right.
an email saying there's been a problem with your account. You need to do this, this, and this. Well, the first thing I do is I go to the known number for my bank, whether it's the 1-800 number or the local number, and I call and say, hey, I got this email. What's going on? And if they say, yeah, that's a legitimate deal, or either no, we don't know what you're talking about, right? That's the clue. But that step, that little procedure can save a lot of time and heartache. And I just recently got a case, or a referral and a consultation where that happened to somebody. They were investing their retirement funds, and they got an email saying
Oh,
that there had been a
geez.
compromise in their account, and that they needed to move their money out of that account somewhere else. And they did it. And unfortunately, it was a
Wow.
scam. And they ended up losing a large amount of money, just through that, right? So it was a combination of kind
Wow.
of a social engineering. It wasn't sort of a business email compromise, although this was
Yeah.
an individual, not a business, but it's the same concept.
Yeah.
And so people rely on fraudsters have relied on, gaining confidence, fear, right? There's a problem with your account. You're going to lose your money. You need to do this now. You need to act quickly. All those things that make you not do those things we just talked about: the due diligence, the checking,
Yeah.
the verifying, all those things, because they want to have you have this sense of urgency that you need to do this now, or you're going to lose your money. And so you're not thinking correctly, and you're not following the steps and procedures you need to follow. Uh, and so those are the main things. Obviously, don't click on anything that's, any unsolicited emails or text messages asking you to update or verify account information. And like I said, look up the company's phone number on your own. Don't just use the one in the email, right? Even when calling for verification, because they may say, if you have any questions, call us at this number, da 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 da, and they have somebody there waiting to answer. No, you go to the
Yeah.
internet in a few clicks and say, hey, what's the number for this company? Or ask somebody else in your department, if you're working in an accounts payable department, and say, hey, what number do you have for your contact person? I want to call them and ask them about this email. And again, just easy steps that you can take, but they have to be taken. Like, people have to do those things. And the scammers are relying that people aren't going to take some of those steps. And then we talked about the
Yeah.
social engineering stuff, the online and social media, the information that people are voluntarily putting out there: pet names, schools they
Oh,
attended,
geez.
family members'
Yes.
birthdays, all those type of things that scammers can use to answer security questions, right? Because we all know the security questions, right? What elementary school did you go to?
Yeah.
Your mother's maiden name, your data, right? All those things. Well, a lot of that's public information because people put it online.
I read somewhere that cyber criminals can find your security questions faster than they can guess your password.
I'm sure,
Yeah.
and I'm not I'm saying I'm not a computer guy. I'm not one of these
Yeah.
guys, that understands how all this works, because you think of the hacker, right? The person in the
Right.
hoodie pulled up in the room that's hacking in. But most of my experience has been that most of the people who do, like you say, get into accounts, they get it basically through social engineering and phishing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, you give them the information that they need to get into the account. They're not using some sophisticated algorithm or coming up with some code to hack into computers. They're just using the information that either they found on the internet or that somebody voluntarily put out there, and that's how they're getting access.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of those Facebook posts that says, "Hey, your superhero name is the color of your car and the last thing you ate." And then, like, everybody goes crazy giving them all that information. Well, heck, the color of your car is a security question.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the make and model, right? That's one of
Yeah.
the security questions that people have. So it's, the information is there, and there are people who will take the time to go out and find it, and they understand how to use it, and they obtain more and more information. And it's something I do in my business as a private investigator. when somebody has me do a due diligence check on someone, right? I go back and try to look into their background and see, and it just amazes me always how much information is out there. But that's the age that we live in, right? We
Yeah.
exchange privacy for convenience to a
Yes.
large extent. Like we give out a lot of information because it's easier. It's what makes it more convenient for us. Put that information out there, and I can keep up with my friends and family, like you said, on the social media sites. I can purchase stuff online, but you're constantly giving up. They have these long disclosure statements that nobody reads, and you click I
Mm-hmm.
accept. But basically, they're saying you're giving up all your privacy rights so that we can use this information. And we do it again because it makes life more convenient for us.
Wow. Well, let me go back. You mentioned something about the bank, and we know that the banks have controls in place. Like you can't just call up your bank and say, I want to talk about my account. They're going to ask you some identifying questions first, and they
Right.
might even have it right on the IVR, and you plug in, whatever they're asking you to plug in. What I think is great for accounts payable teams, because again, I call them the bank of AP, right, is to do the same thing. So you're getting all these requests in. Most of them you may not even expect them, don't know these folks because you don't have a relationship with the vendors. Ask them 2 to 3 identifying questions, whether they're calling or whether they are sending an email request, and just confirm that you're communicating with your vendors or your internal employees for that matter, if they're not right contacting you on a company device. But just confirm you're talking to who you think you're talking to versus a fraudster.
Yeah, and again, another good point, because we've had these scams, business email type compromise scams, where,
Yeah.
like you said, somebody will think they're talking to their boss who is called and says,
Yes.
"Hey, I need you to send this payment here, or I need you to do this," and or they're sending them an email or they're calling them directly, and they're just not talking or communicating with the person who they think they're communicating with. It's someone who's spoofing that person's information and knows the right person to contact. And I've seen that happen in cases where money has been lost or moved around because they thought they had gotten to go ahead from
Yeah.
a supervisor or a boss. But like you said, so
Yeah.
it's about first having the procedures in place and then using those procedures, even though this is an emergency. I've got to have it
Right.
happen now. Whatever, you still have to follow the procedures.
Yes. And even when, because the internal employees that are not AP, that, they don't always understand why we, have to ask what we ask for anyway. And then, we go and start asking for more or start doing more things for our due diligence, make sure it's not a fraudulent vendor. And, they can push back even more. So I think that the accounts payable team needs to do those additional steps, those controls, and then the mindset just needs to change outside of AP to make sure that everyone knows why it's taking longer to get things done. Well, you know what? It needs to be valid. Everything needs to be validated, and that takes time.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and that's always the struggle, right? Like you said, at
Yeah.
the time, it's people outside of AP saying, "Hey, I need this now. I don't have time," and you're saying, "Hey, no, we need to follow our steps and procedures," and it's always that back and forth.
Yeah.
Because people say, "Well, why do you need all this information? You know who I am. I'm calling," and you're like, "Well, I need to verify. I know you, but I need to verify that this
Yeah.
is correct." Because one of the easiest way to do it, like I said, if a boss calls an employee and says, "Hey, have AP do this," and then that employee, who's a known employee at the company, is calling or communicating with AP, the people in AP may not think anything of it. Like, I
Right.
know this person and I've dealt with them, and this is their email address, and they're confirming
Yeah.
this. They don't know they haven't gotten bad information from the outside, and that's one of the easiest ways to do it without having to go through all the steps of having passwords and all that. Just get somebody inside the company to do it for you, and you've bypassed a lot of their controls.
Yes, that is very true because the accounts payable team doesn't know that the internal
Right.
employee got whatever they got from crook.com or crook on the
Exactly.
phone or whatever. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, so
Exactly.
the other thing you mentioned, and I kind of feel for the person that you said lost part of their life savings, which is so bad for both corporations or companies and individuals. How successful is it to get that money back? And I know the FBI gets involved in that. I don't know at what stage, and I'm sure the earlier the better. But is that a highly successful or?
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers. I've
Yeah,
talked to people. I've done some research, and I know it happens.
yeah,
And it's all about timing, right?
yeah.
So the faster you report it to the FBI, obviously the faster they can get on it. And then and the reason is because it's in the banking system, right? It's not up to the FBI at that point. Is
Uh,
they have to get with their contacts, at those banks and have those charges or debits reversed. And
yeah.
so, what happens? So, in a typical, say, a business email compromise scheme, right? And like I talked when I worked earlier, where they spoofed the email addresses of a legitimate company, had one of their vendors start making payments to this fake account they set up. Then they have we call them money mules that go into those accounts
Yeah.
and remove that money, almost as soon as it comes in and take it out either to their account or to another account, right? And once those
Yeah.
transactions starts happening, it makes it more and more difficult to reclaim that money because then it's going to end up outside of
Yeah.
the country or it's going to end up in cryptocurrencies, right? And in crypto wallets. So, but if you can find out quick enough and especially with the larger banks, Chase, Bank of
Yeah.
America, and Wells Fargo, those type of banks, they have procedures in place where they can, once if law enforcement, the FBI contacts them, just says, "Hey, we believe there's fraud involved in this. We need you to reverse this." They can do it, but it has to happen fairly quickly, and like I said, and it has to be reported to the agency first of all, and then they can start the process. And what happens, a lot of times it just doesn't get reported fast enough because the
Yeah.
company, first of all, wants to, are we sure this happened? Okay, let's check this out. It's embarrassing, right, for the
Yeah.
company
Yeah.
and or for an individual if the individual is being scammed, but especially for companies because now they got to contact their vendor and say, hey, we're sorry, somebody did this, and so there's all those things that are going on internally from their perspective, and sometimes they just don't know, like, how do we report this, right? Who do we call? How do we get in touch with the right person? And if you go and say IC3, right, for the Internet Complaint
Mhm.
Center for the FBI, or calling that in, well, you're calling a national or sitting into a national deal, but it's going to have to be handled locally. So it's got to go to Washington or West Virginia is where they have the IC3 now, I think, and then come back down to the local field office in that area and to that agent that's actually going to handle the case. Again, that's taking time versus if hey, I can contact the field office directly and try to get in touch with a complaint agent and get this process started right away. But I mean, like I said, unless you've got experience in law enforcement or have somebody there in your security department that has that experience, a lot of places just don't know that. So they're relying on maybe their general counsel or somebody like that who may never have dealt with that either to kind of figure it out, right?
Yeah, and you make a good point because even I didn't know in one of my previous lives, I experienced a fraud too. And I didn't even know that the FBI handled the recovery of the funds, right? And so, what I will do though is in the show notes here, I am going to put a link to the IC3, the
Right,
FBI's IC3 page so that they can report it. And I think there are some other links that I have as well. Like if you're an individual and you want to report it to the FTC, and I know the IRS
right.
has one as well. So I'm going to put some links in the show notes for everyone that's listening. And if you don't have these links to report phishing scams or business email compromise losses, and click on those or save those links or bookmark them, put them in your, I guess, I don't know, security plan or review to put them in your security plan if you are a victim of fraud.
Yeah, because IC3 obviously a great resource for the FBI, and then like you said, the
Yeah.
FTC. has a lot of information and a lot of resources for companies and individuals who may become the victims of fraud scams. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the FTC have some alerts out there, and because it's December, right? They sent actually a couple, I think, this week talking all about gift card scams. And I know we could probably have 2-3 podcast episodes on that.
Yes, we can. Yeah, that's one of the others. Different type of scam, not quite as sophisticated, but it works. Believe me, I've known people who've fallen victim to those gift card scams, and they work.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a great episode. But before we log off here, I'm sure you got some great stories. Do you have a story that still shocks you?
Well, I do have stories. It's pretty hard to shock me now because I've been doing this for 30 years. So, and I don't know if that's good or bad, right?
Yeah.
You become callous to some of this but it does surprise me, I guess, sometimes that the volume of these schemes, and it's scary because you think, nobody's immune to this, right? Like, am I going to fall victim to this one day? So there are a couple of things, and I think I told you about this one before. We were talking about technology, and this happened, and it's probably been 4 or 5 years ago now. Basically, it was a business email compromise scheme. A very large, national insurance company, health insurance company, kind of fell victim to this when one of their hospitals, in-network hospitals, they got, but it wasn't an email, it was a fax that was sent. Now,
a fax,
wow. Right? We're talking about old school technology, but this wasn't a long time ago. Like I said, it was in the last 4 or 5 years that this happened. So this is not, 20, 25 years ago, but a fax was sent basically to their accounts payable department. And you can imagine a large health insurance, they're paying a lot of claims out, right?
Yep.
And basically saying, change the account number for where you're paying these claims that we're sending you. And this was a major cancer treatment hospital. So the claims were large, and it was a lot of them. And they said, change the account number on this fax. And somehow the scammer got it to the right place. Because that was my first thing. Like, how would you know where to send that fax in a company that big that it would even get? Because a fax has to get to the right person, right? It's got to get, it's going to be printed out on some machine. And if they go to the right department, it may just sit there because somebody says, I don't do this job. And they just, right? It just throw it to the side. But it got to the right department. The account number was changed and payments were being made to this bogus account. But fortunately, the large hospital figured it out and said, "Hey, we haven't been paid for these claims," and they notified them, and that's the back and forth, and they actually were able to stop and get the money back that had been paid out.
Were they able to get it? Okay, good. Well, that's good news.
Yeah, because you asked me about that earlier, and I will say this: that the Bureau has been fairly successful at that if it's done, like I said, within the time and everything. So the success rate, I don't know exactly. I don't want to give you a number, but it'll probably be wrong. But they have been fairly successful with that. So so that was good on that end. So that kind of, if you say shocked me or surprised me, how somebody was able to figure that information out. And then another deal, like you said, clicking on links. One of the cases I've recently had in my private work now in the private sector was basically a romance scam, but it was through a dating app where somebody started up a relationship on the app back and forth, and they got into investing, and they sent them these links to invest in cryptocurrency, and they had the person send a large amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to this what they thought was a legitimate crypto investment, and it turned out not to be. It was being run by scammers, and that's become one of it's kind of bringing the technology, like the business email compromise scams, together with the romance scams, right? It's using all that technology to fuse those two together, and that's becoming a big problem out there, where people are falling victim to that.
If you do fall victim, you lose cryptocurrency. Can you get that back, or is that impossible to get back?
It's possible. Again, not being a computer guy, I can't get into all but I know for individuals, it's hard though,
It's
right?
hard.
Because as
Okay.
we know, the whole point of crypto is anonymity and the wallets, and you. But the good part of it is a lot of that is traceable. And I know what the FBI has had success with is some of these where cities have been, basically the malware used to shut
Mm-hmm.
down whole cities hostage, and hey, you got to pay in cryptocurrency. They have been able to actually trace that. For individuals, I don't know of any success stories. There probably have been some. The problem that I could see is one with individuals, they're going to be embarrassed about it. They're going to be slow to report it, and like we talked before, it's a timing thing, right? You got to get on this fast because that money, especially when it turns into crypto, is going to be moving from wallet to wallet, right? It's going to be moving. It's going to go out of the country. I mean, it's going to end up out of the country, and then you got to rely on other foreign governments to cooperate in their law enforcement, and so it makes it extremely difficult to retrieve those funds.
All right. So the moral of the story is find it fast and report it fast.
Right, report it fast. Right, once you identify
Got it.
it, you think you've been a victim. Even if you don't know, you're not going to know for sure, but because
Yeah.
that's not what you're doing investigating, but report it and let somebody, get a jump on it. So hopefully you can try to, slow it down, stop it, and or retrieve. And that was one of the toughest parts of my job when I was in law enforcement. People would come to us, and people come to the FBI. It's always a last resort, right? They try
Mm.
to go back and forth with the person who scammed them. They hired attorneys to try, threaten to sue and all this, and then they're finally like, well, I need to record this. And unfortunately, one of the things I would have to tell them is we're probably not going to be able to get your money back. Right. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just part of it. I mean, law enforcement is not a collection agency per se anyway, but because the money by that time, scammers, and this is even, even before cryptocurrency, scammers don't save and invest, right? They spend. And so the money is going to be gone. It's just not going to be there, even if we can find the accounts and all that. It's not going to just be sitting there waiting for somebody to come get it back. They've used it on other things because they just think I'm just going to scam somebody else out of more money. I don't need to save and invest. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to scam. And so, and unfortunately,
Yeah.
that's you'd have to look people in the eye and tell them that, hey, because you just have the expectation. Like, can you freeze accounts? And it's not that simple. I know we see that on TV all the time with a click of the computer, and that's not how it works.
Oh, well, okay then. So let's see if we can end this on a happy note, some kind of a way.
Okay.
The FBI is there to help.
They are, yes, and they will investigate and prosecute. Yep, that's what they're
That's
there to
good.
do.
I like that. We're gonna end it with that. I like that. But I do want to ask if anyone wants to maybe connect with you or get in touch with you. How can they connect with you?
So, like I said, my company is Dr. James and Associates Investigation and Consulting, and my email address is Darrell Darrell at drjinvestigations with an s.com. So that's probably the best way if somebody feels they want to discuss this further, or they may be
Yeah.
the victim of some type of fraud scheme, or they just want to, talk to me about it or have me do a present. Like I said, I've done presentations on different types of
Great.
schemes for companies,
Yeah.
so their employees, like you said, making them aware because they are the first line of defense, right?
Right.
And so if they're knowledgeable and aware, hopefully they can prevent this from happening.
All right. So, on that note, I want to thank you for coming on and talking today about business email compromise. And let me go back to picking a poke. I love that. The history, like some of the history of fraud. So, thank you. Appreciate that today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 216th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.